Historians, and welcome back. Today, we are discussing the Great Depression and its impact on Mexican American or Chicano identity. As always, I'm your host, Dr. Summer Sherland. So throughout the lecture, I'm going to be giving you a historical overview of the Great Depression and really the significant consequences that were felt by Mexican Americans living in America at the time, and to some extent, Latinos who may not have identified as Mexican American. Now, there are some questions that you'll be addressing in the reading and in your own reflection and research over the course of the next several days. And I may not answer these questions for you in this lecture today, but they may, the lecture may inspire some responses or reactions to these questions on your behalf. So I invite you to take notes and try and be answering these three questions. As I'm lecturing, I want you to be wondering and thinking about the following things. What do you think were some of the psychological, social, and economic impacts that the Great Depression had on Mexican American or Chicano people? Number two, how did repatriation and the Great Depression influence the formation of Mexican American or Chicano attitudes toward the United States? And three, how do you think these impacts manifested in Phoenix, in the Phoenix Mexican American community? So like I said, I may not actually give you the answers in this lecture, but you're going to be seeking these answers throughout the course of our unit on the Great Depression. So maybe you're starting to brainstorm some responses. Maybe you're finding some examples in the lecture that you can use as part of your response to these questions. So there's some basic information about the Great Depression you should know to kind of set this whole conversation into context. It lasted from 1929 to 1939, so the whole decade of the 1930s. Though it started in America, it was felt globally. It was a reaction to World War I and the start of the Prohibition. It caused steep financial declines, severe unemployment, and acute deflation of the American dollar. The Great Depression led to extreme human suffering and profound changes in American economic policies. And it touched nearly every country of the world after it first started in the United States, where its social and cultural effects were especially profound. About 15 million Americans at the time were jobless. Almost half of the United States banks had failed by the third year of the Depression. And even the people who kept their jobs pretty much lost their entire incomes by a third. And it really was a surprise. Only 10% of American households owned stocks in 1929. So when the stock market crashed in 1929, no one really thought the Great Depression, the Great Depression didn't happen because of the stock market crashing, right? So the stock market crashes and Americans kind of thought, well, I'm not one of the 10% who owns stocks, so what does it matter? But because of the way the economic system had been set up, because of corporate financing and credit, essentially the entire economy collapsed when the stock market fell. So what's happening with Latino people living in America at the time? Well, according to the federal census that was taken, there were approximately 1.5 million Latinos living in the United States, the continental US, lower 48, in the 1930s. And the vast majority of these Latinos identified as Mexican or Mexican American. They weren't the only Latinos, however. By this point in time, Cubans, Dominicans, Central and South Americans, and Puerto Ricanos made up a much smaller portion of the immigrant population who identified as Latino, but they still existed on the mainland of America. But not included in this calculation altogether were the 1 million people who were Puerto Rican living in Puerto Rico, because by this point, Puerto Rico was considered a US territory or a US colony, essentially. So early 20th century, prior to the 1920s and 30s, here's kind of the migratory patterns that we've been seeing of Latinos at this time. Though some Latinos predated Anglo-American settlement in what would become the United States, we've covered that extensively in this class, many had arrived only recently. They were responding to a desperate need for labor during World War I, and oftentimes these folks were leaving unrest, political or economic, crises in their own home countries. And as Latino immigrants moved to American cities in particular, they really transformed the landscape. They influenced the Southwest, the Midwest, and the Northwest in equal measure. Hundreds of thousands of Latinos from Mexico and those Latin American countries I've already listed arrived between 1900 and 1930. So leading up to the Great Depression, you have hundreds of thousands of Latino immigrants arriving in America for the very first time. Here's who some of them were. They might have been Mexicans fleeing the violence of the revolution. That was the largest majority of Latino American and Latino immigrants. They might have been Puerto Ricanos or Puerto Ricans who had been made United States citizens by the Jones Act of 1917. Most of the Puerto Ricans arriving after that point were moving to New York City. There were small numbers, like I said, of Cubans, Dominicans, Central and South Americans who began forming colonies or communities, enclaves in Chicago, New Orleans, New York, and Tampa. In parts of the Southwest where we're focusing, in New Mexico and Colorado, you have migrants coming from Mexico who migrated to urban areas in the 1920s, but then returned to rural life in the 1930s. And then likewise in California, you have these unemployed agricultural workers who are pouring into the cities. So instead of going into the rural communities, they're now going into cities in California, seeking local government assistance as a response to the Great Depression. It's really easy to see that the Great Depression, though it was very difficult on most Americans, it was significantly more felt by Latinos in America. Latinos, without question, were the hardest hit in terms of all Americans at the time. Most Latinos, this is because most Latinos who arrived between 1910 and 1930 were considered working class. They were among the poorest populations at the time. But they formed the backbone of a lot of different industries: mining, agriculture, and textile, clothing or cloth manufacturing. But even though they were a significant part of the workforce, Latinos were always restricted, or most often restricted, to the lowest paying jobs. They received less than half sometimes, but definitely less pay than their Anglo counterparts. And they really could be moved in and out of jobs very easily. This was also a great time of what's called xenophobia, which is fear of the other, or classism and racism, which put Latinos at a great disadvantage in the 1930s. All Latinos, everybody with, a Latino look, brown skin, dark eyes, right? Someone who might be considered Latino was automatically perceived as a foreigner, as a newcomer. This is regardless of citizenship. So this is pertaining to people who lived in the United States long before the Mexican Revolution or the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It didn't matter, right, if they had been naturalized as citizens or if they were Puerto Ricans who were citizens under the Jones Act. They were all considered strangers, outsiders, immigrants, and called aliens at the time. These immigrants, or American citizens, regardless, were the first to be fired, because employers gave preference to Anglo or white workers. But what's really hard is that everybody was losing their job during the Great Depression. So even though they were first to lose their jobs, they weren't the only ones to lose their jobs. But as a response to the Great Depression, the federal government, as we'll see in a moment, instituted a ton of sort of like outreach and charity programs to help people get back on their feet. But Latinos were shut out from welfare and work relief programs as increasing numbers of government and charitable organizations adopted what they called citizens-only policies. But that may have been their policy, citizens only, but in practice, it was really whites only at the time. So there are some times in American history that are disappointing and troubling to learn about. And this is one of those times. The Great Depression was a very difficult time for everyone living in America. And Americans responded in good and bad ways. This is one of those bad ways. Mexican repatriation occurred during the Great Depression. The largest movement of Latinos, so the largest migration of Latino people during the Great Depression occurred among Mexicans and Mexican Americans who returned or were moved to Mexico. So from 1929 to 1937, over 450,000 people, this was close to half of the United States Mexican origin population at the time, were repatriated. What this is, repatriation is essentially the movement of Mexican origin people who were sent to Mexico / back to Mexico as repatriates, new patriots or returned patriot, right? RE, patriot. So citizens, immigrants, people with visas, anybody living in America who had a Mexican origin was sent back to Mexico. They were repatriated. This was triggered by the economic woes of the Great Depression, and it was exacerbated by that rising tide of xenophobia, like I mentioned, hatred, racism, and fear of the other. And I went ahead and fixed that slide so it says close to half, not close to have. So how were they sent back? How were they sent to Mexico, these repatriated American citizens or Mexican citizens? Well, in some cases, repatriation was voluntary, meaning people chose to move back to or move to Mexico. And I'm cautiously not simply saying move back or repatriated back, because not everybody already originated from Mexico, right? Many of them had been living in the United States since they were children or since their parents were children, so they were United States citizens. But so sometimes people moved back, as families, or they moved south to Mexico. Most of the time it was involuntary. It was not a choice made by these Mexican people or people of Mexican origin. And a lot of times it was kind of somewhere in between. So the most sort of notorious or concerning cases of involuntary repatriation occurred here in the Southwest. This is where self-deputized, meaning everyday ordinary citizens who took law enforcement into their own hands, took it upon themselves to rid their communities of unwanted populations, primarily Mexican people or people of Mexican origin. What these groups of typically white working class men did was they would round up Mexicans and Mexican Americans without regard to their actual citizenship status and physically remove them to parts of Mexico, places in Mexico on the other side of the border. They were called vigilantes, right? There were also some more official programs that came at the local level. See, more common than vigilante roundups were these official repatriation drives, which were taken under by city and county officials and supported by the Federal Bureau of Immigration. Local leaders, for example, in Los Angeles, shocked by the thousands of new people coming into the city and trying to get relief programs or welfare, saw repatriation as an alternative to providing support for the immigrant families in their community. So instead, what these people did, these are local politicians, right? City council members, state senators, or state representatives. They insisted that a one-way train ticket would be cheaper than paying for welfare over the course of several months. So what county leaders did was they organized train rides to Mexico and paid for the passage of hundreds of Mexican citizens, and sometimes also for their American-born citizen children. And between 1931 and 1934, more than 13,000 people rode from Los Angeles County into Mexico on repatriation trains. And there were similar programs elsewhere in Colorado, Indiana, Minnesota, Michigan, and other places. One famous case in Texas, there was a roundup of Mexican citizens and United States citizens, and the trains were sent into the middle of kind of a unknown area of Mexico, and folks were dropped off and there was nowhere for them to go. They just kind of were stranded in this tiny town in the middle of the desert and no access to their friends or family in Mexico. The federal government got involved as well. Federal repatriation drives focused on what they call destitute aliens. So aliens, as many of you know, is a real awful term. It's kind of a slur intended to make people who are immigrants to America seen as scary or threatening outsiders, right? And destitute is a word meaning like someone who's super down on their luck, has no access to wealth or finances, and they really need support. So federal repatriation drives focused on immigrants in particular who were in need of financial assistance, like everybody else in America at the time. So people of Mexican origin made up the largest percentage of people who were sent to Mexico in the 1930s. And repatriation drives driven by the federal government were largely ineffective. So even though they were promoted widely, only 9,549 sort of distressed immigrants of all nationalities were officially repatriated between 1931 and 1940. But what the federal government was successful in doing, and not success in a good way, right, but something that they set out to do and they accomplished, was promoting the concept of fear and increasing their efforts for deportation. So repatriation is the return of someone to their original home, right, their original or home of origin. Deportation, unlike repatriation, entails official government proceedings and a change of deportability, meaning someone is sent somewhere and not allowed, right, to return illegally to enter the country ever again. So repatriation is a little bit softer of a term. Deportation is the forced exit or the forced removal of a person, and they're never allowed to return to the United States again. So what the Bureau of Immigration did was they capitalized on immigrants' fears. People were afraid at the time, and they were afraid of being deported. So the Bureau staged high-profile raids in very public places, including workplaces like in Los Angeles County, where immigrations raided a popular park in the middle of the day. And it was exactly what you think it was. They just stormed a park and rounded up people into paddy wagons and sent them back to Mexico. What happens was plain clothes, so people not in uniform, officers barred the exits to the park. They asked everybody there for citizenship documentation, and 400 people were questioned, but only 11 Mexicans were actually ever taken into custody. So what you can see here is that the fear of deportation, the panic that this kind of event would inspire, was just as powerful as the actual detaining of 11 people. If 400 people were stopped and forced to provide citizenship or documentation records, and 11 of them get forcibly removed from where they're living, from their families and friends, even if you don't have this widespread return or sending of people to Mexico, the raid still had its intended effect by spreading fear and making Latino Americans and Latinos feel scared and like they needed to hide. Another thing the federal government sought to do was control the use of visas. And the federal government denied visas to any Mexican citizen who was, quote, likely to become a public charge, or someone who was likely to engage in what was called contract labor. Now, contract labor is just like non-salaried labor, and a lot of Latinos at the time were migrant workers, so a lot of them were contract laborers. So this was one way that the federal government was able to limit or stymie the approval of visas during the Great Depression. And the enforcement of these visa restrictions, combined with the lack of opportunities across the border in Mexico or in the United States, effectively cut official admissions of Mexican citizens from 38,000, almost 40,000 people, 38,980 in 1929 to only 2,627 people in 1931. So over the course of 3 years, you have a significant decrease of official visas being granted to Mexican citizens. And like I said, there was some voluntary repatriation. Some Mexicans who chose, or Mexican Americans who chose to move to Mexico during the Great Depression because the situation was so dire. Most of them, however, did not move to Mexico because it was like bright and shiny and sunny and what they wanted to do. Most were influenced by a variety of factors that helped make clear to them that they did not belong or they did not feel welcome in the United States. Primarily, there were no jobs for anyone, and really people of Mexican origin were the least likely to get jobs. And they had no access to public programs because they were shut out from federal, local, state, and county charitable programs. So what happens to those folks, right? Well, the first wave of voluntary repatriates tended to be better off. They were the ones who left in the beginning of the Depression. They drove their own cars with their own belongings in tow. But as the Depression worsened, as it worsened for everyone in the United States, returnees or repatriates moving to Mexico had it way worse, and it was much more difficult for them to get across the border safely. And what happens when they are in Mexico, right? So this is all a story about repatriation and the fear and deportation, right? And the belief that one had to go back to Mexico. Well, unfortunately, most people who returned to Mexico found fewer and fewer opportunities south of the border. The people who were hardest hit were the children, right? The younger people, because a lot of them were American citizens, so they didn't have Mexican citizenship. They had been born in the United States, and they had grown accustomed to the standard of living of the United States. Those who returned to rural areas, especially places where their parents had grown up, had to now adjust to completely new cultural norms, new styles of dress, new types of food, a different language, right? They had a completely new experience in Mexico. And the Mexican government actually sought to help migrants for a couple of years there. And here were some ways they tried to help. In the early years, so in like the late 1920s, like 1929 to like about 1933 or so, Mexican consulates in the United States cooperated with local governments in planning these repatriation drives. So it wasn't necessarily the rounding up of like involuntary repatriates. Instead, the Mexican government tried to make the passage or the voyage a little bit better. That's because Mexico initially saw repatriation as a chance to assist their fellow countrymen and to regain a valuable workforce that had fled during the Mexican Revolution. And in fact, Mexico actually paid for the passage of some of their citizens and attempted to reduce import taxes for any repatriates so that they could bring belongings home, because it costs money to move things from one country to another. And the government also established the National Repatriation Committee, which sought to resettle all migrants in colonies along the western coast of Mexico. So they also set up places for these folks to settle. But living conditions were really hard in Mexico, and most migrants returned to their old hometowns instead. I mean, think what you would do, right? You wouldn't just like go move to some random coast in the middle of a big country, right? Or on the edge of a big country. You'd move back to a community where you actually knew someone. And repatriates were frustrated pretty quickly thereon. They were frustrated with the government's failure to provide for them, and they formed their own unions, which sought to lobby on behalf of thousands, right, hundreds of thousands of people who returned or were called returnees. What else is happening, right? In Mexico and also in the United States, remember, men primarily, but all people are really out of jobs. There's no employment for Americans or Latinos or Mexican Americans in the United States. So what happens is women get to work. Seeking to supplement their family income, Latinas then enter the industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers. You might find it interesting that teenage daughters were the first to go to work usually, but their mothers and grandmothers often joined them. So sometimes you actually had generations of women working side by side in factories. Part of the reason that they were able to access the workforce when men weren't was because women were paid significantly less than men at the time. So it cost an employer less to hire a woman than it did to hire a man. So they struggled, right? They struggled with poor working conditions, very low pay, and they were able, though, to help their families stay afloat. And it's kind of neat. You'll learn more about that later this week, but they found new ways to experience life outside of a traditional gender role and helped create a new shared identity among Latinas living in America. There were a couple other initiatives that might start to help you see a little bit about a new identity for Chicanos living in America. But many Latinos fell back on what was called mutual aid societies or mutualistas for assistance, right? Self-help in Latino communities ranged from highly organized structures, right? Like the Blue Cross, to very informal groups of women who were just like banding together to sell tamales on the side of the road. So in cities with long-standing middle-class Latino populations like Los Angeles and New York, the mutualistas were able to provide some modicum of relief. They raised money for each other. But in most other towns, this support kind of ran out. The federal government provided a lot of assistance to Americans during the end of the Great Depression. You may have heard in a previous history class about something called the New Deal. So there were opportunities for Latinos to seek federal assistance through the New Deal, but make no mistake about it, the New Deal and the GI Bill, which comes later, really sought to help white Americans. They were not as easily accessible. Their programs were not as easily accessible by people of color. So here are some things that become part of America during the New Deal: Social Security, labor reforms, and housing assistance. All of these programs did provide some relief to Latino families. And New Deal welfare relief programs also protected Latinos by insisting that all funds be distributed without discrimination based on citizenship status. So there was where previous relief societies had said they have a citizenship clause, which really meant Anglos only. New Deal programs, at least in policy, said that they didn't restrict Latino constituents. Some programs actually were targeted for Latino communities, such as the Hispanic Arts Revival in northern New Mexico, which sought to teach traditional crafts to the local population as means of both cultural and financial society. An estimated about 100,000 Mexican nationals alone participated in New Deal work programs in the Western United States. But like I said, there were some limitations. As with other racial and ethnic minorities, however, the New Deal left what's considered an ambivalent legacy. So Latinos didn't always look to the New Deal favorably. Despite federal efforts to ensure that immigrants could find financial assistance, some state governments actually restricted Latino access to New Deal programs. So here's an example. In 1937, there's an organization called the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, and it was a federally funded program to get men primarily to get to work. So it was like a government agency one could work for. Well, it was closed to all aliens, to all immigrants. The citizens only policy of the WPA extended to all companies that had any sort of government contracts. So major corporations like General Motors fired anyone that they thought was a foreigner under this clause. And Southwestern craft programs that sought to preserve small Hispanic villages in reality didn't provide a whole lot of workforce skill development. So in sum, Latinos were both benefiting and being restricted from New Deal programs. So remember, I wanted you to be thinking about, like, how could this be creating a new Mexican American or Chicano identity? Well, workers of all backgrounds, united by the trials and tribulations of the Depression, engaged in an unprecedented amount of labor organizing, unionizing in the 1930s. They sought reform, better wages, better hours, and other improved conditions of employment. And here's some facts for you. In 1934 alone, union membership doubled, and there were more than 1,800 strikes nationwide where workers struck or boycotted their own workplace. As the backbone of the agricultural and manufacturing industries in most parts of the United States during the 1930s, Latinos provided the union rank and file in many labor disputes, especially in heavily Hispanic states, particularly like here in the Southwest. Entire families actually participated in labor activities. They helped to staff picket lines, they provided food for strikers, and they helped lobby local officials. And what's great, and you'll see that this is planting the seeds for something that comes later. Notably, Latinos emerged as major labor leaders during this period. It's Latinos who are helping to organize farm workers in California, pecan shellers in Texas, and steel workers in Illinois. And they set in motion a long line of Latino activism. But it wasn't all perfect, right? There was some conflict among Latino men and women. There was such a scarcity of resources that the Depression did end up pitting some Latinos against each other. Primarily, it comes down to a balance between those who were citizens and those who were not. People who were American citizens had fought hard to assert their rights, right? And they had become naturalized under a very difficult process. So they really wanted to assert their own benefits to citizenship, and they wanted to differentiate themselves from non-citizens, from new Latino immigrants. But on the whole, the Depression actually helped unify ethnic identity among Latinos. So even relatively conservative Latino groups recognized that they shared kind of a common fate with Latino foreigners. All of these discriminatory policies of no aliens, no immigrants, no Mexicans, it really created long-standing kind of consciousness among many Latinos, citizens or not, in America. Second and third generation Latinos who had previously argued to restrict immigration and increase deportation had kind of a change of heart when they began to experience harassment and discrimination themselves, even though they were, in some cases, natural born citizens of the United States. And those remaining in the United States realized how precarious it was. They saw how scary this moment was in time. No matter how long they had lived in the country or how much they had given themselves and of themselves and their resources, they were among the most vulnerable population during the Great Depression. So here's where you begin to see that Latinos are enjoying a sense of common ground. They have a new identity, a new communal identity that's born out of repression, and it leads to greater political mobilization. And though there were a lot of local and regional Latino organizations that had emerged prior to this time, it's during the Depression that you begin to see national Latino groups coming to prominence. And the one that you probably should know the most about is LULAC, right? The League of Latin American Citizens, which was founded in Texas in 1929. And increasingly, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, and other Latinos came together to fight for all sorts of civil rights, not only in the workplace, but also in courts and schools and places of a public accommodation. These things happened in the 1930s, setting in motion what will happen in 30 years later in the 1960s, when you begin to see a bigger push for a strong pan-ethnic Latino identity and a push for civil rights after World War II. So I want to go back to those original questions that I wanted you to be thinking about. What were some of the psychological, social, and economic impacts that the Great Depression had on the Mexican American or Chicano community? How did repatriation and the Great Depression influence the formation of Mexican American Chicano attitudes toward the United States? And how do you think these impacts may have manifested in the Phoenix Mexican American community? All right, everybody, that's it for today. I hope you learned a lot.